The devil is in the detail, as the saying goes. For the aficionados, the devotees of Opus 109 Beethoven Sonata in E major, well, these could be two of these details that enlight the hearing, the selective understanding of the details which, in a way, blossom through the piece. One can say that every detail is important when you work with a masterpiece which you serve to perform at what you would like to consider it's closest to what it's supposed to be, as subjective as that is. But nevertheless, you can observe very intensely some details and come to believe that if they are intentional, or perhaps somewhere between a copyist and a publisher's first draft, it might have slipped the attention of the composer. That is not unlikely, but whatever the cause, the fact is that it's on the score, and therefore we have to deal with it intending it intelligently, while embedding it with a certain lining of intuitive understanding, not just because you recite what the book says, but also because you bring meaning into it after you observe that. So the first situation occurs at the end of the first cadenza of the first movement, which brutally interrupts the peaceful and so heavenly opening. And when this heavenly opening resumes, then you have the ending of this stormy interruption that comes through the shape of a dominant scale of B major, which slowly, drop by drop, returns to that section of the dreamy opening into the development. And during this soothing scale, legato, pianissimo, and in a way, of course, on the straight-strung pianos of Beethoven, changing registers was almost changing instrumentation between, I don't know, flute, clarinet, oboe, bassoon, passing the torch through that scale combination of sounds. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, apparently, as a storm, perhaps a Sturm und Drang, comes this staccato of F, G, A, B, B, with a sforzando and staccato indication, as if almost coming in a way to break the dreamy situation of this scale, which is soothing after the interrupted, dramatic, diminished seventh chords of the opening. So you would expect it to be just a soothing transition to the return to the dreamy. So some pianists and some teachers and some performers, from the point of view of the scholar understanding of it, researching through manuscript readings and different editions since Beethoven, during Beethoven's time, and of course today with all the authenticity-driven editions, we have the understanding that somewhere, somehow, these has to come as a incongruous moment where you don't really understand what's happening, or you pretend you don't, but it's happening nevertheless, almost as if a trombone enters in a wrong entrance few bars earlier during a calmer section. If it were a comic effect or some kind of spirited effect, like Haydn's humor in sonata forms, when he does some things like a surprise ending or a fake ending, or that kind of humor, the disruption, and then. So I don't believe in this late sonata of Beethoven, who at that point was unfortunately deaf, but also Therefore, the music that he expresses is almost the essence of his thoughts, without any coating of seduction, of good manner, of politeness. It goes to the point from the get-go. And therefore, now when people listen to it, it might appear unimportant, miscellaneous, some kind of a, well, it's odd, but it's not essential. It's not motivic, it's not elemental, it's not part of the developmental organization of the thoughts of Beethoven. It's just sort of like a passing situation which appears to pass without to be disturbing too much if the pianist plays softly. And if the pianist decides to play it a little more brought out, then it becomes part of the conversation, so to say, musically. Now we go to the second cadenza, the recapitulation end of the movement, which also starts with a diminished seventh, similar to the first. It goes through big arpeggios, like the first one did also. So there are parallelisms, and that obviously has to do with the fact that symmetry is part of the sonata form, even if from Haydn's time Beethoven has already broken a lot of the rules, starting with a slow movement to take not but that, and organizing a different way of fantasia sonata style in two movements, if you take in account that the second line of the double line at the end of the first movement is not thick. Therefore, it could be meant that the ending of the first half would be the second half of the same movement in the prestissimo. And this is a rhetorical question that can be interesting for scholars, but not really for musicians, pianists, or listeners, because regardless how you consider it, in terms of the formal construction, which is important, but nevertheless not determining in this detailed question that I want to bring out to you, and is the ending of this stormy second section, which I call the second cadenza, which parallel to the first, which ended, remember, with the scale and the staccato rising tetrachord. Then in the ending of the second one, he uses broken thirds, parallel sixth in both hands, rather than a simple scale in single hand. Of course, in B major for the dominant, and then now in E major for the tonic, tonicizing in the recapitulation. And then the fact that it doesn't come up, you think, oh, if you remembered that disruption the first time, if you noticed it by reading it, by hearing it, analyzing it, whichever way the perception of details comes to the attention, then you realize that he arrives very low, and he dropped from to this, quasi the whole scale of the range of the fortepiano of the time. And at the very end, he does have that rising tetrachord that he had the first time, except he doesn't write staccato, which could be assimilated by not being in any slur as a non-legato, if neutral legato, if that existed, when you don't have a sign for a slur and you don't have a staccato for a specific character like the first time, then you could assume it's just perhaps quasi non-legato legato, wet legato, dry legato. So there are ways to camouflage it the second time, not to bring it out as the first time because of that articulation difference in the notation. But I think it's very interesting to observe that the detached sound of the second time coming under the double sixths it's a meaningful reminder, formally speaking, to the initial, clearly indicated to bring out time. So, what do we do with this? Do we assume? Do we expect? Do we desire? Is it a question of logic in terms of the restatement, be it in different circumstances, but nevertheless it is a ascending tetrachord. So symmetry being what it is, I personally would go for bring it out. At some point you have to take a subjective opinion decision, regardless of how much you become aware by learning, reading articles and books and scores and different editions and reading the facsimiles, because you want to know, you're curious to know. As I said, when you're the aficionado or the devotee of 109, you want to know everything about 109, regardless what you do with it in terms of how you play it or how you expect to be played. But the devil is in this detail. It can highlight a symmetry, or it can just be put in under the rug by saying, oh, the second time it shouldn't be as prominent as the first time, since there is no staccato nor sforzando. So the engraver of Beethoven's time, the copyists of scores, Beethoven's own vigilance about such a detail. I don't want to speculate. I think it's unnecessary to speculate if it's intended or accidental in some shape or form that it led to this way on the scores presentation. But we have to deal with it. We have to make sense of it. Similarly, the other devil's detail, so to say, expression, is in the prestissimo movement, which comes after. Is it second half of the first movement or a second movement? So he uses a sequence that drops by step from the dominant B minor, so what do we observe? In a sequence you reproduce a pattern. The first time it's obviously on the dominant of the dominant, which is in B minor, and you have, what do you have in the right hand? Sorry for my head voice singing, but it's on pitch at least. Well, more or less. Since he writes prestissimo a barre beat by groups of 4 of 6/8 each, 1, 2, 3, 4 to the dominant question, 5, 6, 7, 8, closing to the tonic answer. Then second statement, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Variation of it with busier secondary voices, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Secondary thought, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3. So you have this incredibly driven motoric, obviously pulsed prestissimo, which is not even presto, therefore rushed, literally, rather than fast. Driven, leaning forward, unstoppable. And what is in the sequence in that situation, their melodic line doing a hemiola in the 6/8 by 2 times 3 become 3 times 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you count in 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a syncopation if you count in 2, but if you do hemiola in 3/4 in the 6/8, 2 times 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Regardless if you think of it as a hemiola or as a syncopation because of the displaced time counting in 2, the first reproduction is with that pattern. Then the second, a step lower, is on the beat, and the third reproduction takes the same pattern rhythmically of the first. So it's uneven in its reproducing the melodic line in the reproduction of the pattern. Now, jump forward to the recapitulation, where he does the same thing towards E minor, obviously, and he goes 1, 2, 1, 2. It goes so fast that it's almost unnoticeable. But the second time, all of the reproduction of the three patterns of the patterns 3 times of the sequence are by step, and therefore in each step he does the same. Ta 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 tam pa pam ta 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 tam pa pam pa ta ta tam. Whenever the first time, as you remember, out of 3, the second was different because he was not in the hemiola syncopation. It was and then. Now this is more and more a detail, if to say, especially when it's played fast. And it is supposed to be played fast. So it's like things that pass when you look at the window through the for the landscape or something from the bullet train speed. Things in a blink of an eye can change. And so you could assume that I'm making a big fuss about so little because, in fact, it's a passing section. It's a transition. It's obviously syncopated in part, not consistently both times the same way in the exposition and the recap. Okay, fine. You can say that's his right. And it is true to be not predictable and creating therefore a detailed difference which overall perhaps doesn't appear right away, but if it's always on the same pattern rhythmically, you would say it's too predictable. Therefore, is there a reason for which in the recap it's predictable? In the first time, there is a discrepancy out of the 3 reproductions of the pattern. And that is a puzzling question. You could wonder if you would like to take on you as a performer, in your subjective involvement, love, care for the piece, to make another symmetry happen by reproducing the way in the second time. Therefore, what's the problem? In fact, I think everything in Beethoven seems always to be, structurally speaking, in terms of architecture, always very, very, very thoughtfully done. And it could be that either again this detail escaped him in the correction of the edition's preparation, or was it that somehow it slipped between the drops of the attention of the proofreader and the engraver at the time? I wonder. And it doesn't change really much objectively. I must often think that while the detail is essential, because I spend my life teaching this sonata, and every time I teach it I discover more layers of things that are intriguing me. It's natural. Researchers do that in science, or biographers do that in archaeological researches about characters that they try to describe the connections of their thought processes of their life's flow. I mean, how can you not? This is like a treasure cove, and of course it's a masterpiece that is set in stone, and it's obviously the case. I don't advocate or pretend to advocate that you can customize it, but the fact is that when discrepancies like this appear, You can deal with it one way or the other. Dismiss it, make it a case. I decided to allow the informed students to take their own decision, especially at the level of graduate students or doctoral students, because in ways they are the scholars of tomorrow, who will define by editing scores, defining through articles specific elements about the aesthetics and the ethics of Beethoven's writing and how we deal with these situations in terms of, first and foremost, displaying them, as I just did, or also as finding solutions to deal with them. I find that binary answer, yes, no, it's a little bit simplistic, because Beethoven's thought process was something that, of course, we don't have the capacity to reach ourselves. But even from the point of view of the worm looking at the sky, we can still perceive things. Perhaps at our own level decide that if these details aren't defining for the interpretation of the piece, which I don't think they are, they're contributing to the... Every detail is important, but the whole is more important. The micro, the macro, this is that I always try to find the equation, the harmonious balance for the student's advice. And you know, I come to think interpretation is, of course, something that should not be added on top of the piece as a piece. It should be the reflective mirror of it towards the audience. If not, we all just read the score. We don't need players to play them. Therefore, bring them out or not, or how much. But that is the privilege of the subjective moment of the performer, who during an ephemeral moment in their life serve a masterpiece, and in their will to do it at their best, they have to find answers to some of these situations. And I offer them analytical options to display these situations, not to correct the score, not to try to apply logic where the composer could have been preferring to leave this kind of willing discrepancy. As my teacher, Mademoiselle Boulanger, would say, if you don't like the way he wrote it, write your own, but when you play his, make it as he wrote it. So therefore, in this case, I would even go play the discrepancy meaningfully, or apparent discrepancy, for lack of better word. I think you understand I'm not disrespectful, nor second-guessing the intentions of the composer, or if it were any kind of consequence of some mischecked, misproofreading or something. Now comes the question about the real interpretational decision, is how you choose the tempo of these two sides of the same coin movement, or two movements, be it short as they are, slow and fast. And this is something fascinating to me, because when you observe the notation of Beethoven, you realize that the prestissimo, as I demonstrated a bar a bit by counting the structure of the hypermeter group of bars, one can theorize it and imagine it in one's head, or solfege it, and define that the motoric busyness, like the middle section of that prestissimo, is when the left hand plays the ostinato continuum. So that would be the gauge of the inside metronome in ourselves, to remember when we open that section, in order to have unity through the piece. When you have less notes or more notes, busy or not busy, but always the same pulse, since that is what's supposed to be a sonata. Different characters within a form, and the pulse and you can see it clearly through the notation. All the bar lines are clearly indicated, and dividing all the group of notes by 6/8 notes, even if they're of course grouped and overlapping with the ties and all that. But nevertheless, there is a desire to organize the flow, which thankfully the listener doesn't hear the bar line, but the flow through which all this is going. And I think that when a movement like the opening is dreamy and distant and almost unreal, and then in minor this is driven and active, no more contemplative like the opening, but profoundly, dramatically driven as a statement of almost ferocious proportion. You feel borderline anger expression artistically compared to the floating upbeat, downbeat, undetermined, just with stems up for the melody to be perhaps not too hardly brought out because it's part of the whole flow. And then the first and second discrepancies, description that we saw earlier. So when the sonatas were 3 movements or 4 movements in the Viennese Haydn school, it was a moderate tempo for the first and a flowing one for the last. And Beethoven did that with but when you start a sonata with a slow movement, as he does already in 78, with a reflective introduction before the theme, comes in a moderato, and the second and only other movement is the thought-provoking with a German 6, and driven and playful and spirited. Then in 90, the other 2 movement sonata, you enter in the middle of something before even having been introduced. There is no introduction, it's just directly you're on. And the second movement is almost like a soothing answer to this. But can we even consider that a sonata form to Haydn's fast, slow, fast? I think Beethoven then explores further with the opening of 101. String quartet texture, 6/8, with hemiola in the middle of the transition, but always driven through a gentle flow of long, short. Resolution always. And then immediately comes after, in contrast, dotted rhythm march, Schumannesque in its anticipation. Well, obviously Schumann, Beethovenian himself, rather chronologically. Yes. What does that mean? You know what I think? It means that when Schumann does, in his fantasy, we have the same drive as Beethoven already calls for it. Even if the detail in their Devils is that some of the dotted rhythms are tied and some are with a rest. So inevitably when you hold or breathe, if acoustic and resonance and pedal come inside all that in the mix, it becomes all alike. But nevertheless, it's dotted rhythm and driven after a dreamy first movement. which is on the dominant of F major, and this F major therefore is the the deceptive cadence in minor, flat 6. And of course there is the fugue in the finale, after a very brief slow movement. So it's not really a two-movement sonata, but it becomes more elaborate. Then comes, of course, the inevitably 109, also starting dreamy and slow or calm. And then the prestissimo. And then 110 starts also string quartet, but this time more in dialogue rather than in flow, but reflective. And after the introduction, you have the aria. And it finishes with a hemiola ending the 2 bars of 6/8, making 1 of 4 anyway. And then not prestissimo this time like in 109, but Allegro. Typical Beethoven, displacing accents on the weak beats to become their strong beat in a will to switch the pulse of the expected downbeat. Beethoven is a transformer, not only of the form itself in these cases, but also in the pulse, making the strong beat weak, the weak beat strong, with those provocative sforzandi accents on the upbeats. So yes, you can argue that these choices of his are, of course, the creativity of a genius who breaks the mold of his inheritance of the sonata form that he wrote so many in the early parts of his life, Haydnesque sonatas in their form and their expression. So he evolves in his expression, therefore he breaks the form, and he decides to play mostly slow movements at the beginning of the sonata and then the faster movement. Therefore, for the interpretation of these, we have to define how fast is fast, how slow is slow. Unfortunately for us, the metronome Melzel, marketed in the 1820s in Vienna, was not in Beethoven's usage when he wrote the sonatas, not even retroactively as he did when he got one of those conic, incredible first metronomes that look like a pyramid with a pendulum and a weight that is gradual to have how many minutes how many beats a minute, forgive me. You reach to objectively define a tempo, which he did for his symphonies, though most people consider among the conductors they're unplayably fast in terms of tempo. But that could be his inner fantasy rather than the reality of the orchestra performance, since he used this metronome partly at the time when he was already deaf, or also that he could have read the under part of the weight to not just faster. Who's to know? Regardless, at least there is an objective point of view that we have a number of beats a minute, dot, which meant Melzel metronome, and then you have 68 to the quarter note or something. And by the fact that Melzel, who owned the wind-up dolls store in Vienna, the window display was supposedly the marvel of all the children and their parents to watch these marvelous moving animated dolls, even a chess player doll that was very famous at the time. In that window, he displayed in parallel the metronome, which he marketed, and therefore by copyright obliged the publishers to write most through the 19th century M equals whatever. But okay, this objectivity that Beethoven searched for to leave as a posterity for the way to think the tempi, the pace, the pulse of his symphonies, he didn't do it retroactively for his sonatas. Either he didn't own the scores at home after, of course, they were sold to the patrons who commissioned them, or just didn't happen, regardless the reason. So we are still back to square one, defining how fast is prestissimo, how fast is allegro compared to the first movements, if they are whatever they are, of 109, of 110, of 101. And by extension a bit earlier in 78 or in 90. For their second movements each, contrasting faster for 78, contrasting singing for 90, dotted rhythm for 101, or for 109 having this prestissimo. And for the 110, the Allegro. Of course, one can also argue that it's not just a question of pace, tempo, speed, it's also meter. And therefore, organization of group of bars, obviously if you write in square 2/4 or in 6/8, you have a different sense of the distribution of the beats within the pulse inside each bar group of beats. Yes, so you take all this in account, and then you think also in terms of how much do you bring out these detailed discrepancies I mentioned earlier. If you go so fast, perhaps people don't realize. So if you do the difference that he did the first time, it would be. It appears that things are going faster than you can grasp as a listener. Of course, you can read the score, you can study the score without even hearing it, and just infusing your intellect with the intensity of the Beethovenian thoughts, let less in which pace, because then you can start thinking about traditions, countries, geographic situations where tempi were considered at different meaning, since it was relatively subjective, but also regional, and of course in its own time, when Beethoven composed it and people played it, in a certain way today we are detached from this reality of the music making, this ecosystem of his time period. We research it more like in a archaeological way, if you went, or even musicological, ethnomusicological way. So we can say with a certain tradition that a prestissimo in Germany would be not a prestissimo in Italy. That's understandable in terms of the geographic differences, which also bring civilizations to have different temperamental rapports in societal situations and descriptions of contrasting reflection to action difference. So you could very well think that therefore playing 109 in a more moderate tempo would be. Therefore the prestissimo would be. And now if you want to enhance the ratio of difference between the two, you can start relatively dreamy and play very fast. And then you realize that, in fact, the rapport between slow and fast is as important as how slow is the slow and how fast is the fast. He can say, oh, but it depends on the mood, the day, the acoustic, the resonance, the piano, the action capacity, or the technique of the performer. So if that is the limit, then sky is the limit. But it's not because you can that you should. And if you should, then you should think how much. And what is the overall construction of my understanding of the piece in terms of its proportions? I speak of the level of movements combined, an oeuvre with different sections, call them movements. And so very often when performers start playing one of these sonatas that start with a slow tempo, regardless of how slow, very often in their desire which is very understandable in my opinion, to create that contrasting, driven, fast element. Then they would play perhaps outside of any analytical, independent section by section understanding, something very exaggeratedly fast, just to create the immediate departure of the contrast. Same thing with this, therefore. And I think that if you ask students to count loud voices, I did earlier for this prestissimo, then they become their own conductor who doesn't play, but is a master of the pulse and the beats and the groupment of beats, and is sort of strategically pulling by starting the upbeat before the musicians play, and having the equal downbeat to the original beat to constantly pull the orchestra to him or to her, going through the movement as a guide, and they as a performer who follow him and who perform what he suggests or she suggests in the upbeat. So that, would it mean that becoming a pianist who is also the conductor, when you finish a movement, like the ending of 109's first movement or section, you should tell yourself 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and continue 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Inhabit that pulse in all the sections, busy or less busy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. As well as in 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. In his bridge returning from the B section, which abandoned the eighth notes after the ostinato. 2 and 1, 2, 3, 4. So of course you can apply the famous metronome that today is electronically in almost every smartphone of my students, and no more the iconic pyramid-like pendulum style. Okay, nevertheless, it's not because you play every pulse correctly, evenly, and that you fit all the notes by practicing with the metronome to make sure you don't go outside of the track. I think the ultimate tempo keeping, once you choose it, guideline is to know strategically where you could catch back the tempo in case you have lost some of the momentum due to the texture difference. And nobody could tell me that everybody should be playing in a constant pulse, even if you have, in this case, dotted quarters and a lot of eighth notes. Of course it should be, because that is what the objective fact of the paper says, but in reality the sense that you give when you perform to a listener that you're always in track is that you're also not rigid on track, that you can also allow yourself to take a little bit of a side view to impress the listener, yourself first and foremost, reflecting what you read by how you heard it to how you're going to bring it out. Therefore, in this subtle, quick, brain to tip of finger reaction, you allow to be expressing these lament expressions, which in a string plays would be a light, slight glissando, and that is not really slow down, it's not really officially rubato, it's just more like playing with the guideline of the melodic dotted halves of the scale, and then on top express these affects. So I know that the two are incompatible, the strictness and the time taking for the expression of these affects. And the piano being a factual instrument rather than instrument, you touch the string, you vibrato on it, or you touch through the voice, the air column, the way you project the sound, you shape it in the air, so to say, literally, as well as the wind players, of course. And the string players with the length of bow and the speed of bow and how many notes they take in the bow and where they change the bow and what it means in reinitializing the pulse. So I think that the smart thing to do is to always plan ahead when you study it. Okay, A prime comes back, and if Beethoven chose to finish the B section into dotted quarters, almost stopping with even the fermata, as if the listener thinks that the storyteller gets lost in its own dreams and all of a sudden comes back without even the modulation because of Beethoven's modernity. But regardless, for the pulse here and the tempo, I think it's important to tell the student that it's wise to regain the faster tempo in the transitional section that is still dynamically soft, because that is where you can subtly return to the tempo that you accepted to have slightly lost the pace of it if the texture calls for it, as it does here in my humble opinion. So therefore, when you arrive here a little bit under tempo, and then you have the reproduction of it in the top register, I think this time you should be already in the prestissimo tempo of the opening. But while you play pianissimo, the reproduction of the ending of the dotted quarter section. In other words, you re-enter in a subtle way back into the pulse so that it doesn't appear to be at once. But it's already in the flow, even if you're in the of the pulse, but in a different mood in terms of the texture and the dynamic. 2, 3. You can think it in your head when you play da, 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 if you were to be. And be your own conductor, strategically knowing where you have to catch up the tempo, where it's not noticeable that you have to return to it after you have lost it a little, or how much little you will allow it to be. Even if by metronomic practicing you should not allow it, because there is no indication in the score saying it's meno mosso or a little slower. But if everything is only played as written, and it has to be, but not all, because the way things flow into each other, the arts of the transitions, the merging in traffic from a tempo to another, or from a mood to another, from a texture to another group of textures, orchestral suggestions of Beethoven from different ranges. All this is happening in the flow of beats and indication by groupments, which is obvious by the hypermeter. But within, I believe you have to be flexible in order to be musical within the structure, and not because of the structure playing just strictly without having time to even express any of the effects and just go for the pulse. It's right, but not completely. And if you take too much freedom, pendulum swings the other side. And in order to express all this emotion, you completely drop to an andante. Then inevitably, no matter what, the return will be surprise, recall, attention, hey, you lost your tempo. I believe that in the formal evolution of Beethoven's sonata writing from the Haydn-Viennese school set system, is the art of the subtle transition, like in 101. Dotted rhythms, and the transition is with triplets. In order to return from the B section, which was completely without dotted rhythms, but very even eighth notes, contrasting, linear. And if you chose not to use triplets, but 16th notes right away, you're already in it, but not transitioning subtly, going from 2, 3, 4 eighth notes, triplets or 16th notes a beat. So it's a rhythmic accelerando, or in the case of this 109's return to the A prime, he spaces the last two chords, which are the dominant, the tonic of the dominant. In a way, rhythmically, you create that ritenuto, but very metrically, so to say. Yes, I think that it has to be very important that the mature student plays strictly the indications, but meaningfully. And what I mean by there is that they have to come up with an option of their construction. How fast is fast, how many bars you do in one hypermeter group, and how you think the structure. Of course, the conductors do but that, because they don't have anything else to do, in the sense that they don't play actively. And the performers, especially the pianist, busy with the two hands doing so many things going on, very often we don't count to guide ourselves as if we were our own conductors, our own orchestra. We follow the flow, and sometimes we adjust as it goes, and we don't give ourselves an opening departure beat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. But inwardly we should. And count independently of the melodic or the artistic expression of the section, legato or staccato. To achieve such difference between our guiding, our playing, and combining the two in mirroring answers, which is an internal dialogue between the pianist and the performer within one. I think Beethoven Sonata observation, reflection, is an incredible cathartic tool. It allows you to rethink, to rethink the status quo, to allow to, even if you are in a tradition from a teacher or a score or the editor or the recordings that you praise, and everybody chooses a certain lineage in which they position themselves, but ultimately it's how you answer to the text. Beyond how others answered and how others will answer the text, it's your time to define it, even if it's away from the time frame in which it was composed and played. Because then the interpretation was not a separate element that had to be well matched with the composition, since it was the composer who played their music most of the time. And fellow composers, colleagues, they played also music of each other, but inevitably from a composer's point of view, so they thought naturally outside of the box while playing the piece. But the separation of the filière, I don't know how to call that, I would say the depth of niches between the composers not playing, the players not composing, the musicologist thinking, and the performers just reacting to the thoughts of the editor, therefore of the scholar. Okay, it's a bit schematic and probably a bit sounding not subtle enough to be true. It sounds a little bit caricatural. But nevertheless, it exists, in the sense that nowadays the interpretation is an oeuvre over the oeuvre itself, matching differently according to different tastes, opinions, and ways of thinking, and therefore the pulse, the tempo, the articulation, the direction of the line, the groupment of bars, the flow of the events, the bringing out inner voices or less or more, bringing out discrepancies like the devil's details. All these are part of all that. Ultimately, when you play, you don't speak, you don't explain. It's not a demonstration, if it were, unless it's a conference. But in a concert, you say all what you say in the piece through what you understood from the piece, in the way you can display it through your playing. And of course, you can betray your thinking through poor technique, or you can enhance through very good technique weak thinking of the piece. That is not incompatible. Of course, the composer if player is one, the teacher doesn't play. The teacher advises, organizes, suggests, gives tools to better handle situations in terms of fingering, articulation, or even display of the action between the hands differently than the way it's notated, because the notation doesn't always reflect the intent. Regardless how the pianist's level of the composers were involved in. Of course, it's very subjective when you play Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, Chopin, or Liszt, because you play it with their fingers' thoughts. And when you play Beethoven, yes, it's his fingers, but also his thought. It's a lot of that, more that perhaps. So we consider those things at different levels when we play it. But when we play, we have to display through the flow of the events how we organize our thoughts, therefore how we think the thoughts of the composer to be organized in the way we present them. I deeply believe in this dialogue, internal dialogue between us performers and the composer's intent through the notation, which of course it's in the eye of the beholder, because we can make it say what we want it to be. And we can invoke traditions for the tempi, and we can invoke traditions for not missing or losing the tempo. So yes, rubato, not rubato, how much rubato? It's not just so simple. It's part of the music itself in the expression as you perceive it, for the level of musicianship in which you place yourself. And because Beethoven evolved so much in his writing from the early sonatas, which had on top of their structure also, I called it seductive level of musical coating, which doesn't take away from the brain of Beethoven, but it's also a different thing when you open this. Beyond what it is what it brings us as a feel, as a mood, as an atmosphere. And you can say that, oh, I like this sonata better or this sonata less, because somehow we filter it through our own psyche in a way, or this, or and you could say, or, but then the last movement. So I guess all of us rising the standards of our understanding, because we want to serve the score and serve the students who want to serve the score. And there we are in a situation of scholar plethorically endless curiosity to understand how to organize all these tempi, phrasings, articulations, perhaps temporary truths, even if we can question them in a later revisitation of our interpretation or our teaching of the piece itself. Because in a way, all of us who live with the Beethoven sonatas on the piano, we inevitably live with them, and they live with us, and since we evolve, they evolve with us too. And I think it's healthy to be not sticking to some, of course, bases, but not to some habits. After all, a new student has a new point of view, and it's not less valuable just because they're not experienced and that they come to trust you for this or that. And if you have to establish that trust, you have to expect, I believe personally, to accept their intuitive guessings of situations that I have sort of answered myself, and I don't want to be rigidified in my answers, because I feel like while I believe in them and I want to help the student, guide them through to avoid them perhaps going in a wrong or in a dead-end lane before they find their own flow forward into this, through this, I still think that it's a two-way lane between the student and the teacher, and we both stare at the score to try to this voicing, this rhythm, this delay, or this rest. Why did he finish 109 with chords? And why didn't he finish continuingly with a pattern that he opened? So is it a reflective resume of all of the movement before the end, and then he doesn't give us all the answers, thank God, and there are not necessarily need for answers, but to frame, to place, and to organize the questions, I think helps a student clear their thoughts in their own choices. It's not about play like me or play like him or them or somebody. It's play like yourself once you're informed, but without losing your own connection to it. Because if not, if teaching is spoon-feeding one's own understanding and love for the piece, then the student will never sound convincing in turn, other than if it becomes part of their own musical journey in the piece. So I find it's very delicate and important to not only impose, but also convince, also bring the climate so that the conversation goes openly about detailed questions that can lead towards one or another decision. That's finding fascinating. Fascinating. A bottomless pit, but at the same time an incredible sensation of humility and the idea that there are still layers to discover in pieces which we're supposed to have mastered. And that keeps us very humble. And at the same time also respectfully we question the status quo and accept to disagree, serving the muse.